Booyah!
So at this point, DLC is basically an ingrained part of the gaming industry. Every single AAA blockbuster game has some form of DLC, and every single developer tries to push their consumers to buy a season pass in order to get the maximum amount of DLC they possibly can. DLC will not be going away anytime soon, and today I want to talk about two things. Firstly, why publishers and developers are putting so much effort in to create more and more DLC for each mode of content they use, and secondly, at what point does DLC get ridiculous? To answer the first question, all I have to do is apply the very simple laws of business. As gaming got as big as it did, i.e. it grew so fast, like from the hundreds of thousands into the millions into the tens of millions, it became an industry. It no longer became an art form where a few guys wanted to make a game. It became a massive industry with hundreds of workers. And for that reason, the basic laws of business began to apply, which is one of the main basic laws is that in order to apply good business, have to give the minimal amount of output while giving the maximum amount of profit for that output, i.e. giving less for more. Like, for a good example of this would be Coca-Cola giving smaller bottles but charging more for those smaller bottles and acting like it's the same size. Those kinds of things are very much ideas of good business. This is very similar. As it became a business industry, people have been trying to get maximum amounts of profits out of less chunks of their games. Like, people have been splitting out parts of their games without telling consumers and using them as a sort of way to give off good DLC rather than just making DLC afterwards. Now, there are some people who just add DLC later on, but a lot of the DLC these days has been just people making full games, like massive full games, and then taking out small chunks, breaking them into smaller chunks, and then charging for each of those very, very small chunks. A lot of games have had that recently, and it's becoming worse and worse as the years have went on. Like, DLC has definitely increased in how extreme it's gotten over the years. In saying that, there is a good reason as to why a person would want it. Firstly, it helps the developers keep themselves going, and secondly, it helps the consumers remain satisfied with the game and the content they have if they really, really love a game. However, as I've been already talking about, a lot of publishers see this as a business prospect and not as an art form, and as a result, they tend to charge a lot more for what they're getting. Now, in saying that, there is a very big difference between charging because you can and charging because it keeps you going and you're providing extra content. There is a very different cap. The first cap I would talk about in the difference would definitely be the amount you get for the price. That's just an obvious one. Think of Borderlands. When you bought Borderlands, you can get a full new storyline, a new character, and a bunch of other smaller things for about $5. That's a pretty good value. Then you think about SimCity. I heard they charged $1 for a blimp. A freaking blimp. It didn't add anything, it didn't change the game in any way, and it didn't really make the game in any way more interesting. It was just money for the sake of charging money. This is when it gets to the sake of complete obscurity. I do not understand why people would charge that much for something that small. That is the first thing. The second thing is in multiplayer, when they charge money to play better than other players in the game. This is alright in single player modes, but in multiplayer modes, this is completely unacceptable because you cannot have the size of someone's wallet be a decider how well they play a game. Like, there are certain games where you can get certain handicaps by paying money. These kinds of microtransactions are pretty ridiculous, and I wouldn't really recommend any of them. Now, the third kind of DLC that I think is kind of ridiculous is when it makes no discernible difference to a single player game. This is the opposite of a multiplayer. In a multiplayer game, it's completely fine, but in a single player, there's a problem where if you buy like some random skin for £2 that literally does nothing to the game except look cooler, you are giving them an excuse to break it up even more past that point. This is the main issue I have with DLC. If you keep going to these ridiculous lengths to buy these ridiculous chunks of DLC, all you are doing is giving them excuses to break it up to an even more ridiculous level. So, in saying that, there are two different kinds of DLC. There is the one where it is just a developer and a publisher trying to keep themselves going financially, so they will keep releasing new parts of the game in order to keep themselves going. And then there's the type with certain companies like Ubisoft, Activision, and EA that just kind of charge you for the sake of charging you for the most ridiculous things because they see it as a business prospect and not necessarily as an art form. That is why they usually cause limits on time in terms of making games in the first place. Anyway, that's all I want to talk about. In my opinion, DLC is not a bad thing, unless it is abused to the level it is with some publishers. And the only recommendation I'd give for anybody who sees this ridiculous stuff is don't buy it. Because if you buy it, you make them think that they're able to keep this shit going and break it up to an even more ridiculous level. The best way to counteract this is to not react to it. So maybe this entire video was an oxymoron in itself. Shit.